that your video is off and you're muted, and you can always drop us a text in the chat and we'll be in touch. I just give a few more minutes for people to trickle in. All right, I see the numbers growing over here. Welcome, everyone. If you're just joining us, just so you know, we are recording this session. Make sure that if you don't want to be in the recording, make sure your video's off and you're on mute for the entire time. If you have any questions or any concerns, you can just drop a text in the chat and my team will be in touch with you. And I think I'm going to start with the session. So before we begin, we want to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and also Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, colonially known as Vancouver. This is where Threading Change headquarters are and where I'm located. We also have folks joining us from different parts of what is called Canada, from different traditional territories, and also from the rest of the world. And as we express our commitment to reconciliation, we strongly believe that it is our moral responsibilities as settlers on these lands to ensure that our meetings and actions are congruent with Indigenous peoples' values and interests. And as we walk down the path of reconciliation together, we want to make sure that, acknowledgement is just the initial step, and it is by no means a replacement to the necessary work that needs to be done to walk towards the path of reconciliation together. And at Threading Change, we're continuously committed to learning and relearning as we are settlers on this land. Moving on, we'll go through just the guiding questions that will guide us today. So, we've heard a lot about how garment workers who make our clothes are exploited in the global south. Bangladesh in the fiscal year of 2021 and 2022 exported about 42 billion US dollars worth of garments, making it the second largest apparel exporter in the world, and it also employs about 4 million people. India, on the other hand, market size is worth about 223 billion US dollars and employs about 38 million people, and that's about the population of Canada. And the guiding questions that will guide us through the entire conversation today is, how can we implement actionable strategies to support garment workers in Asia and also foster a more equitable and sustainable fashion industry? And what are the on-the-ground realities and challenges of advocating for sustainable practices in Asia's fashion industry? So, being a Western organization, we understand that, there's a lot of nuances that we may not be aware of, and on-the-ground realities. So we brought in experts today for you to, hear it from them on what exactly it is like. So here's the outline of what we're going to be doing today. So I will be sharing with you who we are, what our team, our values. Then I'll be welcoming the panelists and we'll dive into the conversation and the questions. We will have a Q&A session right at the end of the discussion, and then I'll share information on how we can keep the conversation growing. So, the why. When we think about environmental pollution and um, what exactly it means to cut emissions, we usually the first thing that comes to mind is your aviation industry, your oil and gas, or or tar sands in Alberta. But fashion almost never comes to mind, despite being responsible for 10% of global emissions. And, just like any other industry, it has, pollution, fossil fuel addiction, it has inequitable labor, dirty water, and more. But it's hidden behind this veil of glamour, and that's why it's called the Trojan horse of industries. And that's what piqued our interests in wanting to work in the fashion industry. So at Threading Change, we have this motto that we often use, and it's a feminist, fossil fuel free fashion future, or 6Fs. And it all comes back to our values, which is we're committed to upholding intersectionality, placing people before profits. We are a youth-led organization, and we want to amplify youth voices. We also center underrepresented voices while working to meaningfully collaborate with a bunch of different sectors and organizations like you see here today. We are youth-led, justice-orientated, and who works on inputting these values into everything we do, whether it be through a webinar, a new program, or even our value map. So here's our team. Sophia Yang, who's with us today. She's the founder and executive director. We have Louisa, communications and engagement director, and I'm the Asia expansion lead. You'll see we have a global presence, so we have a hub in Africa, and we have a hub in India and also in Europe. And we do education and awareness through our textile talks, a webinar like this, a global innovation story map. We also do youth engagement and events, and also policy advocacy in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So before we actually dive into the conversation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that today is the anniversary of the Rana Plaza collapse that occurred in 2013. For those of you who don't know, the authority, the reason this plaza collapsed was, there was authorities that had permitted the building that was originally planned for commercial purposes, but it was then converted to industrial use, and additionally occupied by 5 garment factories. And it collapsed because earlier audits were inadequate, and warnings were ignored and dismissed. And in the end, because of structural integrity, the building collapsed, and we had a death toll of about over 1,000 people, 1,000 garment workers, and that has catalyzed a lot of the fashion revolution work that I'm sure Shruti will probably be talking more about. So I'll just introduce our panelists today. We have Shruti Singh. She's the country head of Fashion Revolution India. We also have Abhishek Jani, who is the CEO of Fair Trade India. And we've got Mohammad Razu, who is a social justice activist, previously worked with Oxfam Bangladesh, and he's now working on human resource organization in Bangladesh itself. So Shruti, I'll start off with you. Why don't you come on and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shruti Singh, and I'm the country head for Fashion Revolution India. Just to give you a little bit of background about Fashion Revolution is a global campaign working towards safer, fairer, and more transparent industry. 11 years ago today, on 24th April, a factory in Rana Plaza, Bangladesh collapsed like ash shed, and it killed more than 1,100 garment workers who were making clothes for the world's largest brands. Fashion Revolution was born as a response to this horrific incident, and it was a global call to build an industry in which no one dies for fashion, where worker rights are upheld, and where there is dignity in work, and workplaces are safe. And through Rana Plaza collapse, we learned that people were searching through the rubble to find labels in order to understand which brands were actually producing in that factory. And often the brands themselves were unaware that their products were being made there. So this realization led to the creation of Fashion Revolution. And one of our core projects and the work that we do is called Fashion Transparency Index. It's an annual report that evaluates and ranks 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers based on their public disclosure of human rights and environmental impact policies and practices. We have observed a shift in how brands approach dialogue regarding traceability and transparency, which clearly was not the case 11 years ago. But we believe there is a lot of progress that is yet to be made. And in India, we work on this issue through education, through advocacy campaigns, through policy research work, and with engagement with MSMEs in the fashion industry. And I'm really looking forward to the dialogue today.
Thank you, Shruti. Abhishek, would you like to come on out and share about your experience and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ash. And I'd also like to thank Spreading Change for having me here for the panel discussion. So really wonderful to be here. So I work with Fairtrade India project, which is a part of the Fairtrade International network. Our core objective at Fairtrade International is to basically reduce exploitation behind our food and fashion choices. It's easier said than done. We've been at it now for over 4 decades, and I think still a long way to go. But yes, there has been certain sparks of progress, which has kept the movement alive, and we do call ourselves a movement because we're a multi-stakeholder platform and an organization. We are one of the global networks where 50% of our decision making is with networks of farmer organizations and worker organizations in agricultural value chains. Most of our work actually is focused on food and fashion value chains, so primarily agricultural centric. Our work is to ensure that there are better practices followed on farm level, so ensuring better socio-economic and environmental practices, so that there is no discrimination, there is no exploitation. And one of the key insights that we have picked up over the years at Fairtrade is exploitation leads to further exploitation. So we say exploitation breeds exploitation. So we need to appreciate that some of these conversations are multi-layered in very complex and global value chains like food and fashion. Specifically speaking, in the context of our work in the fashion industry, we work a lot with cotton farmers. So cotton farmers in India, cotton farmers in Pakistan, Central Asia, also in Africa. So looking at how cotton cultivation itself can be made more sustainable, socially as well as environmentally, but also ensuring that the cotton farmers get a fair price, because that is one of the biggest reasons why there is so much economic distress, even at the farm level, for one of the biggest raw materials in the fashion sector, natural raw materials in the fashion sector. Further up the value chain, we also work in factories where we are evaluating the social indicators of working conditions of what is happening in some of these factories that work with us. And also looking at that all important aspect that Shruti referred to, which is traceability, and through that, hopefully also promoting transparency. We also have a somewhat ambitious agenda to try and promote living wages for workers in garment factories. So we've developed a program around it, and we're trying to see how we can get the uptake on that so that there is a time-bound commitment for better livelihoods there. In addition to that, and also in India, we also engage in campaigns, we engage in programs for consumer awareness building around sustainable choices in food and fashion, and the impact that our everyday choices have on lives that are literally hundreds of kilometers or thousands of kilometers away. So, how it's all connected actually. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to the exciting conversation today. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. That gave us a lot of insight into your work and sort of help paint a picture of, the landscape of what's happening in India as well. Next up, I'm just going to invite Razu to come on to share his background and also the work that he does in Bangladesh.
Hello everyone. My name is Razu
अभी तो कोई
Ahmed.
और शुरू हो जाए
Yeah, I think someone is talking about it. Okay, so my name is Razu Ahmed, and as Aish introduced me as a social justice campaigner here in Bangladesh, but I would love to say today that I am a witness of the Rana Plaza issue. I can remember my days on that time. I was in the rescue operation on behalf of Action A team, and I have seen the reality from the very ground. And I can remember it's a shame that the judiciary process is yet not up to the mark, and the people who caused this catastrophe, they did not get their punishment. This is an unfortunate and a very shocking signal for us that we couldn't make it. Still, we can hear the people's struggle who survived from Rana Plaza. So it says that we could have identified thousand and something a number, but I believe there was 5 factories, and even in Bangladeshi context, I can easily assume that how many people was there we couldn't identify, even we couldn't count them. So my expertise is not on the labor side. Rather, I involved myself for last 10 years in the climate justice movement, and I have seen there are a lot of anomaly in between the policy holders and the worker groups and the industrial owners. So we are trying to kind of build a consensus between different interest groups because the business has their own interest because the climate activists they are continuously pressuring to their impact to the environment. On the other hand, workers are getting impacted, but they cannot recognize the way because they cannot relate with the climate impact with their daily lives. But they can see they don't get enough payment. They're suffering with their health, but they cannot relate with that. On the other hand, the nations are struggling, and the brands they're struggling how they can support to the workers, to the industries for a fair and just transition. So my journey with Oxfam is kind of facilitating a dialogue process and bringing different interests into a common platform so that they can discuss, they can negotiate, and we can come to a kind of cut-off point. Because the earlier days, I believe, living wage movement and all the workers' struggles has a very strong link with the climatic catastrophe that we need to address. Today, I think the CSDDD was approved by the EU, and we can see there would be a very serious linkage with the business interest countries like Bangladesh and India, because there are many clauses that the industries and the business group will be punished and they might have lose their business. And their business has a linkage with the workers' interest, I think a couple of millions workers. It says 4 million in theory, but we know the number is higher than that. So my expertise on supporting kind of facilitating policy advocacy with the governments, with the brands, and supporting worker groups that they can grow their understanding how they can what can I say, like pursue their interest to the global platforms. We have seen they are missing from everywhere. The fashion charter was developed and designed and is moving forward without worker groups involvement, and so the national policies at the ground, the government is completely ignoring the worker groups and trade unions and labor groups because they are not in a position to contribute in on that scale to the climate policy. So my job is to support them. So this is what I did with Oxfam till February, and now with the Business and Human Resources Center. Uh, so this, I think this is enough from my side right at this moment. I guess we get enough time to discuss more, and excited to know many things about
Yeah,
two other speakers and the guests. Over
yeah.
to you, Aish.
Thank you, Razu. Yeah, it's very interesting how that, even if you're talking about just transition or energy uses, it is all interconnected. If a brand is doing well and they have the proper channels to link with their workers, then they will be able to pay them better. And just that intricacy and the red tape that surrounds just this collaboration itself is such a tough field to navigate. So we're just gonna move right into the questions. So first one, how can advocacy and public policy be effectively leveraged to enforce sustainable practices and enhance the rights of garment workers in Asia? Shruti, why don't you start with that, and then I'll have Razu come in after that.
I think I'll speak more to advocacy first. And while in last many years, vast number of people across the globe have become more aware about the problems in the fashion industry and how it relates to their life and the interconnectedness to other problems that they see, a lot of people are still unaware of the impact their clothes have and how they may be contributing to climate crisis or human exploitation or landfills and waste issue. And one cannot change or impact what we don't know or cannot see. And that's why it's really important for, on one hand, brands to be transparent, but advocacy also plays a really important role in bridging the gap between what we read on the label, what we know from public disclosures versus what actually happens on factory floors. And I believe this knowledge has the power to shape consumer behavior, influence industry practices, and also inform public policy. So one of the campaigns that Fashion Revolution has, which is Who Made My Clothes? Such a simple question, but a very powerful tool for advocacy. And people have taken this conversation to consumers to demand from their favorite brands who made their clothes, what conditions they were made in, were the workers paid fairly? Is the workplace safe? Is there grievance redressal mechanism in place? This campaign has advocated for transparency to safeguard the workers, celebrate the talent of makers, embroiderers, tailors, weavers, artisans, pattern cutters, and numerous other people whose hand make our clothing. And we've seen that brands have responded and have been responding to it with answers to this question with I made your clothes. They know that consumer care about when they know that the consumers care about this kind of information and that this information may influence the consumers purchasing practices, that's when brands have the ability to change how they look at their practices and production practices as well. In India, pre-COVID, there was a program that we did called Wellness for Workers, where we curated this a wellness checklist for small and medium-sized brands, because it's not just the big brands. It's we have a very, like, in fact, most of the brands in India, in terms of the number of brands, a lot of them are MSME. So it's important to engage this dialogue at bigger brands, but also at smaller brands. Similarly, What's in My Clothes raises questions about hidden realities of materials, chemicals, processes in the fashion supply chains. The idea of advocacy is simply to empower consumers, brands, industry bodies, policymakers with data and with an ask, so that they are able to make informed choices, and we're able to demand for greater transparency, traceability from brands, and not just to think of the final product of fashion till the point that it reaches the consumers or retail stores, but to really look at the life cycle of it. Where does it come from and where does it end up? Because there are a lot of issues with people who are working on the waste side of the textile value chain, and what they are exposed to. And landfills are also places where you have a lot of hazardous fumes that are in the air, which can impact the health of the people who are living around and the safety of people who are working in those landfills. I think there has been in recent times a lot of shift in the way, the role that advocacy has played in the industry. And we've seen that with a lot of consumers getting informed. We've seen that with a lot of collectives and a lot of organizations organizing themselves to advocate for better practices. For example, Good Clothes, Fair Pay. There were a lot of brands that got together and organizations that got together to really advocate for why it matters to have good clothes, and there are no good clothes without fair pay.
Yeah.
So I would say that we have a huge advocacy has a huge role to play. And I know I didn't touch a lot upon the policy aspect, which I'm hoping Razu would focus more on.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
for
So
sure.
the biggest thing is, I think, the biggest achievement of the advocacy is today's declaration, the approval of the CSDDD in the European Union. So it's the biggest success, I must say, from the civil society and human rights groups. So the next level of advocacy should be, that to focus on a deeper scale, that how this law and sort of policy arrangements can benefit the workers and vulnerable groups at a different level into the world. Because I can say is there is a punishment system which is very good, because fashion industry and particularly which is responsible for 10% of the global emission, and the CSDD is very strict on their sustainability practice and human rights due diligence. But if it impacts to the business without giving proper support to the business groups, particularly countries like Bangladesh and India, and if they lose their business, which is also linked with the human rights. I think if business lose their businesses and the workers lose their jobs, this could be a very counterproductive thing, and it can bring something else with a positive notion of the advocacy. So the next level of advocacy should be focus, gather information that how these things can be more inclusive, and how the vulnerable groups and people who needs to protect their human rights can be benefited with this sort of advocacy achievement. So even at the country level, while I started working with the Bangladesh government and particularly the industry association, which is BGMEA in Bangladesh, for the fashion industry, we found that in terms of the renewable energy transition, they are struggling with the high duty that imposed by the government. It's a very counterproductive role from the government, that in one way government is saying they're trying to promote renewable energies, and they impose 15 to 38% import duty on the renewable energy technologies. So we try to showcase this sort of experience to the government level, try to educate and united the labor groups and the industrial groups to push the government and inform the brands that how they can come up. Because we found there H&M and few other brands, they have created some space for their suppliers so that they can take financial support and instrumental support and can scale up their renewable energy share. But it's not the H&M cannot change individually, cannot change the entire country scenario. It requires a collective effort from the brand. So we started initially also and other ETA and other partners. We designed a kind of dialogue at the brand level, and we bring into the workers groups so that they have particular interest in it. Because we have seen in the during the last year so many small scale industry worker, they lose their job because their industry had to forcefully shut down while the nation was in the power cut and there was energy shortage. So
Mm,
these are very key instrumental and powerful tools that advocacy can
mm,
solve and can meaningfully contribute at the national and the global level. Again, the same at the top level, the fashion charter, which is still now, I must say, mandate of the brands, and there was nothing related to human rights and worker voice. So I think Sophia was in the COP. I was in a couple of discussions related to the fashion charter, and I have found very shocking. There are a few brands they are trying to promote some sort of false solution within the charter. So these things needs very strong resistance from the advocacy groups,
right.
and it can entirely change the ecosystem, I
Yeah.
must say. Yeah.
Yeah. So to just summarize, advocacy from grassroots level, making sure that people are actually paying attention to different modifications to the industry, just as a regular person, you just simply asking, hey, who actually made my clothes, and like going up to that brand, and making that question can actually catalyze a lot of the different changes that we can see in the brand. So I'm just gonna have you on here just for another couple of minutes, Razu. Can you share a case study where, just transition principles have been successfully implemented in the apparel sector, and what were the key factors in its success?
So it's a partial success. I should have to disclaimer because it's all about individual and passionate industries effort. Because while we try to support Bangladesh industries for shifting their energy transition, the biggest question is coming up that Bangladesh is popular in the global market because of its cheap price. So industries they are struggling to determine their minimum price, and when particularly in the last year when the energy price going high, we have seen a lot of worker protests happen because this is the fact that industries was struggle with securing their production, keeping their production cycle on and securing their energies rather prioritizing paying to the workers. We have seen those things has a very strong link at the ground. And we found while we started advocating to the industries and trying to promote them with renewable energy options, we have realized in one point this requires a kind of $1 million investment. And in industry, without any financial and instrumental support, it's completely impossible for any industry to move forward. So we have found one particular industry, Pacific Jeans, which they have made significant, shift from their from fossil fuel to renewable energy. They have cut their 10% with the rooftop solar, and we found because it was possible for particularly Pacific Jeans because they are not a big industry in Bangladesh. They are one of the top 2 to 3 industries in the world. So they can foresee their future, they can foresee their business potential, and they made an investment. So that's why I think with their individual interest, they made a shift, and they just prove it that rooftop solar works, particularly for Bangladesh industry case, without any policy support from the government and or any financial or instrumental support from the brand. So we calculated and taken the case of the Pacific Jeans and tried to showcase the real experience that if the government reduce the import duty and the sourcing countries, because
Right.
in the Paris Agreement developed countries they say that the technology transfer would be voluntary,
Right.
and now we can see they are doing their business,
Mhm.
particularly they try to make it a business case. So if we have a favorable policy and we have support,
Right.
instrumental and policy support from the brands,
Mhm.
how these things can be a very good business model for the other industries who are waiting for this, because it requires a kind of setting a kind of example that other industries can see and they can replicate it. So Pacific Jeans example is very encouraging, but still Pacific Jeans have done it without any sort of policy and instrumental support from the government and or brand or the global community, I must say.
So, so if they're large enough, they can make that change, but then it will only go so far without the policy support and infrastructure support,
Exactly.
right? So if
So their example helped me to document, that how the policies and the instrumental support is in place, how it would be easy to for the other industries.
right, right, right. Oh, that's encouraging then. All right, we're just gonna move on to the next one. Abhishek, just gonna have you come on. So what are some of the strategies that have, proven most effective in engaging communities, industries, government bodies? You sort of work on an intersection of all of these different stakeholders, and what kind of action plan for sustainable, equitable fashion practices?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Aish. I think, when we look at bringing about any change, in the fashion sector, for instance, we have to recognize that some of these uh, current conditions are not new. These are deep-seated. Some of these are literally systemic or even intergenerational. So the solutions or the strategies for bringing about that change are unfortunately, not a magic bullet. It's not going to happen, in, let's say, a season or a year or even, half a decade. But I think what we need to appreciate and develop right from the start is first and foremost a recognition of all the relevant stakeholders involved. So, for instance, at Fair Trade, it is very important for us that whatever standards for sustainability that we talk about implementing has a buy-in. Yes, the business case and the business must be involved, but critically, there must be representation and involvement of, let's say, farmers, if we're talking about conditions on the farm, or let's say setting a minimum price there. It must have a representation of the workers and the unions when we're talking about setting working condition requirements for sustainability. And so that's where, in the work that Fairtrade specifically does, we bring in a multi-stakeholder approach with that, building that consensus across different stakeholders up front, so that we are able to find a framework which then has relevance and can also be applied on a business, everyday business basis. Otherwise, you could create a gold standard of, the best practices, but you will not find uptake of that by anybody in the industry. And at the same time, as we've seen world over, even in India, you have fantastic laws. So, for instance, in India, child labor has been abolished decades ago, and yet you will find, there are some instances of that around, right? And that's not just for India. That is true for. I mean, we are finding that it's even relevant in developed countries like UK and in maybe even in Canada, right? And so laws like the Modern Slavery Act have been brought in even now, and still not fully achieved the objective. So it's not about dictating something; it's about creating incremental progress models, which you can then keep revisiting and seeing progress, right? So I think that has been something that we've been looking at, and the fact that it is not unidimensional or representing only one stakeholder's perspective, but has a multi-stakeholder genuine participation, where Fairtrade in our model plays more of a role in the middle of a moderator to try and find the balance for that next step of progress. So that's been a way in which we've kind of developed our standards. In fact, currently we're going through a series of our standards reviews on textile standards, on our contract production standards. We've literally just started a discussion around reviewing fair trade minimum price for cotton. Now, all of these conversations actually that we are building are multi-stakeholders and are about finding the next step of progress. That is the critical aspect.
All right. So that's sort of I'd say like a tech word that they use is the back end of production. Shruti, what has sort of your experience been, in specifically engaging with communities and artisans and sort of, having this pushing for the sustainable and equitable fashion practices?
I think in terms of strategies, Ash, it's really important to collaborate with people, but really collaborate, because sometimes what happens is we go with our point of view, and if you're trying to engage a community but you do not listen and you do not hear them and they're not part and they don't have a seat at the table, then we're not really doing anything which would be long term and bringing systemic changes. Second thing which we've learned is to engage communities, industries, and government bodies, and to engage them together, because solutions will not be built in pockets or in silos, is to really have discussions and roundtable dialogues. So we've had stakeholder engagement dialogues on pertinent topics. Recent one was on craft in the age of climate crisis. We were trying to address and understand how climate change is impacting craft ecosystem, craftspeople, their livelihoods, and on the other hand, also trying to figure out, can craft in some way and indigenous wisdom and knowledge hold answers, methods, techniques which can build low impact, low environmental impact, low carbon solutions for the fashion industry, because craft and fashion are interlinked in that sense. And to find these answers, we used multiple strategies, but doing a roundtable was one. And we really ensured we curated people on the roundtable from uh, and India is diverse. So we had from people from different backgrounds, different languages, different regions, from different economic backgrounds, to really understand what the crux of the problem is and the layers and the nuances involved in that problem. So I feel like those things, smaller things, can make a huge difference, to not have that gap between the community that you want to work for. So we can, like all of us here, we can continue to talk about garment workers, we can talk about advocacy, but without having their voices represented on the table, that is not going to really create an equitable fashion industry. And that's where I see a lot of changes. Even we were speaking about COP. I think I see that move. It's not done yet, but I see that move in making sure that Global South is represented, making sure that youth is represented, making sure that different voices, women, are represented. So I feel like all of those things are really important in making sure that we're engaging people, but also engaging them the right way.
All right. Thank you. That was very well put. And Razo, I'm gonna have you come on and share with us, the challenges sort of that you've encounter as you establish like a cross-border collaboration, especially in your role with Oxfam. The brands that you work with are internationally based, right? So what sort of challenges are there, and how have you overcome these to achieve successful partnerships, so that we can ensure that there are good collaborations, just like Shruti mentioned just now.
Challenges are almost, it's nothing new to us, but to me, I found that even at the COP process, I must say this should be a kind of global effort. But do you think this is really a global effort? At the COP, each country they used to go there with their own dirty interest, how they can win. So it sounds like very good, like it's a kind of global effort, but it's not actually. And even for my experience, as I work as a climate advocate and critically focusing on the worker rights, I have found workers are missing from the every part of the decision making. So even in my country, we have prepared one climate adaptation plan and we submitted our nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC, and we really completely ignored the workers' voice and their interests. And the solution is like there are some sort of typical NGO like solutions, like to bringing workers participation into this sort of discussion. But before preparing them to take part into those level of discussion effectively, because workers now they are concerned about their waste, their workplace safety, their community level hazards. So climate change and these sort of issues they cannot realize, and they cannot even ready. They are not even ready how they can flag these sort of issues and their interest to the policy level. So
Right.
initially we tried to introduce some sort of worker leaders, but the problem is
Yeah.
even the workers' representation is highly politicized in Bangladesh, and so it would be in India, I must say.
Yeah.
So this is not plain and simple, and it requires a lot of preparation, bringing
Right.
their interest. So challenges are very plain and simple, but solution it requires some sort of time and robust preparation. I think preparing workers, because Bangladesh government initially said that they will create 1 million jobs for the climate vulnerables. So
Right.
among this 1 million, how many of jobs they will create for the RMG workers? Is there
Right.
anything specific how many RMG workers are going to lose their jobs within next couple of years if the industry fails to move forward
Right.
with the expected energy transition? What will be the business dynamics, and how
Right.
these business dynamics will impact to the workers' interest? So
Yeah.
even workers don't have any idea on that. So
Mm.
they need to understand it properly. They need to realize the gravity, and they need to know how they can contribute to the national and the global level
Yeah.
discussion. So bringing workers representative into the discussion table is not a solution.
Right.
What unfortunately we are doing right now. without preparing themselves for involving those sort of discussion in an effective manner.
Right. So that capacity building element to it, right? That to make sure that yes, their voices are there, but they're also prepared to have that discussion and negotiate effectively, right? All right, we are reaching the end of our discussion. So quickly from all three of you, what do you think are like key actionable strategies or like one takeaway you want us attendees to have? Because again, we are youth led. Most of us who want to do something in the fashion industry want sort of tangible things that we can sort of help to support garment workers and a sustainable fashion ecosystem. So I'll start with you, Abhishek, and then Shruti, and then Razu. Quick one.
Yeah,
Before we
actually,
start.
there is a lot of things that needs to be done. So I think I'm going to try and keep myself contained to maybe one or two. But I think in the context of the fashion industry, and this is where we go a little beyond maybe what the core remit of fair trade does, is
Mhm.
that for fashion and for our planet, it is imperative that the future of fashion is slower and circular, right? And when I say that, I mean that we need to, unfortunately, even since the Rana Plaza tragedy, the speed of fashion has only increased faster. And now we have the ultra fast fashion brands which are really dominating the scene. So, that is one place that we as advocates for sustainability and sustainable fashion, as the young people who really are capable of bringing about a lot of change. And in many ways, they are also, I wouldn't say everyone, but they're also supporters of the way the fashion industry is getting shaped. So
Mhm.
I think we need to recognize and really push forward the agenda of slower and more circular fashion, which is looking at circularity in how we consume.
Mhm.
Consume less, consume, with longevity,
Right.
but also on production. And so that's the other aspect of circularity that has to also be respected. I think that would be one aspect of it. The second aspect, and I really would like to echo what Razu was talking about, is that we need to look at sustainability in fashion in a more holistic way. We
Mhm.
cannot, and I know there are legislations coming, so like the CSDDD, there is also the greenwashing legislation that's coming, and so on and so forth. But also, brands also do respond to what consumers are putting out there, right? So not just be satisfied if a brand says, "Hey, I'm using recycled PET in my
Right.
fabric," but to say, "Hey, hang on, what is actually happening on the energy and
Right.
water, and also what is happening on the social side to the workers
Yeah.
and the working conditions, and on the economic side." Again, to say that exploitation does breed exploitation. So it is imperative that everybody in the value chain is
Yeah.
getting an equitable price. So I would say we need to have those holistic understanding and push for holistic change, not a piecemeal change and be satisfied with it. And
Right.
second, we need to look at it, the whole industry needs to kind of really reflect and slow down and be more circular.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Abhishek. Shruti, key takeaway, what do you think are the next?
I have
Um,
a huge list as well, but I'll try to keep it short.
you can explain.
Transparency. I think transparency is really important. And while we've seen brands give commitments and talk about action on the E of the ESG, so there's a lot of conversation about environmental impact, but I feel that the social indicators are lagging behind. So we need to focus more on the workers, the fair pay, wages, have a conversation about. There are people who, there are brands who don't even disclose how many workers they have, how many workers are getting minimum pay, how many getting living wages, how many getting above living wages. Do they have any disparity between what women are making, what men are making? So I think we need access and public disclosure on the social indicators as well. The second thing is definitely we need to look at how much brands are producing. So stop overproduction. It is estimated, and it's only an estimate, that 100 billion garments are produced every year. We do not have an exact figure because brands do not disclose how much they make. And that is becoming a huge issue, and has an impact on planet's very limited resources. And that's also the reason landfills are filling up with textile waste. And a lot of those textiles have labels, and they've never been sold, and they've ended up in landfills.
Right.
Third thing is greenwashing. Let's crack down on it. I think it needs to move away from marketing to authentic interventions, and that's a fundamental change for brands, because most of the times when I try to engage with sustainability officers, they are actually reporting to marketing departments or are attached to marketing departments, which also shows how brands are viewing the whole idea of sustainability. And lastly, I would say data. We need to build a case for sustainability beyond the idea that it's a good thing to do, but there
Mm.
is a business case to be made. There are research organizations that show that if you're looking at worker welfare, how that actually impacts your profits and economic, like the output itself. Smaller things like having well ventilated workplaces, well lit workplaces have a better impact on the health of the workers, and that in turn impacts the output. So it's not just a charitable or a good. The more we look at it um, as a case for like, oh, why don't you do it? It's a great thing to do. But you speak in the language of the businesses and the brands and prove that it's actually really beneficial. It's a win-win for everyone. That is one way I see us moving towards a more sustainable and worker-friendly ecosystem.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. So I've got transparency, stop overproduction, greenwashing, and then transparency again. And Raz, a quick one before we open up the floor for Q&As. Key takeaways and
Well,
what is something you think
yeah,
are the actionable?
my thinking is, I think Shruti and Abhishek already covered a lot, but I want to be a bit opportunist because it's now a time like brands, governments, and everyone is focusing on the climate and sustainability. It has some cost. So the big question is who is going to share what portion of these costs. So even though the fashion industry, we have seen there are significant funding mechanism for the sustainable practices under the UNFCCC. We have seen the Green Climate Fund there, but we didn't see any specific arrangement for any sort of green transition or sustainability
Mm,
practices for heavy industries like RMG. It requires separate arrangement, and the money and the moving forward to the sustainable practices, it requires money. And now we can see it's a kind of pillow passing thing from brands to their suppliers, and suppliers cannot do this alone. So this is not a
right.
solution. Rather, it requires some sort of collective solution in between brands, industries, and the government, because brands have their business and global reputation. Industries need to retain their business, and which links with the workers' interest. So all tri-party, they have collective interest, and they can advocate together and push to the global climate funding mechanism to create some sort of separate funding mechanism for bringing more sustainable practice and invest in the sustainability aspect of the fashion industry, so that it can really help at the ground, to
Mm,
meaningfully move forward with the transient solutions. Rather, the dialogue process is good, it helps, but if the dialogue doesn't come up with any practical solution, it
mm,
it ended up with no solution. So it requires a strong push from the global advocate groups. We can heavily capitalize the COP platform under the UNFCCC leadership, and can push to the global funding mechanism to support these uh, heavy industries for their sustainable practices, and influence brands to invest on those funding mechanism and contribute proportionately, because they have a very strong accountability mechanism, I must say, particularly for GCFs and other funding mechanisms. They have their own way
mm,
of maintaining transparency and accountability of using their funds. So
yeah,
so the problem is the trust issues. So we can at least minimize through this sort of utilizing this sort of mechanism in terms of
right.
funding. So this
Mm.
can, I believe.
All right, thank you so much, Razu. So, funding, being one of the key elements, especially in Bangladesh, to sort of move the sustainability needle towards the right. So I'm just going to open the floor for questions. If you have any for like a little bit of a Q&A, I know we are very short in time, so we'll take a couple of questions if anybody has any.
I have a question if no one else is jumping in. So this was fantastic. I learned so much. Thank you. Um, what are some organizations and ways that we can get in contact with garment workers to advocate for, to make sure that their voices are heard? Because we try to do that as an organization, but also recognizing our positionality as mostly based in a global south, a global north. We want to make sure that we're not speaking illy. So that's why we wanted to work with folks on the ground as opposed to be the one to play that role. We're mostly a youth-led organization. We don't want to step on any toes. How would you recommend that we go about doing that?
It's a very practical experience from my side last year while we tried to initiate a kind of brand level dialogue, because brand people who were based in global south, they really don't have any power to make their decisions. They are just serving their global interests. So we tried to do this, but unfortunately we couldn't succeed. But this could be a very good synergies in between organization who has work at the ground, like Oxfam, like ETI. We have used local experience, and together if we can initiate this sort of dialogue process, particularly engaging with the brands, with the local findings, that helps to communicate them properly as well. Their decision makers are based in global north, so that they can come up with their support. Rather, it's a kind of bureaucratic delaying to communicate their representatives who are based in global south. They really don't have anything to do, rather implementing their headquarters direction. So this is a very I can see a very mutual ground. We can strongly collaborate and lift our local experience to the global north and communicate to the brand representatives effectively. It's not with the brands, even with the global north governments as well, because they have their own commitment too.
Right.
I want to jump in and say again to access and opportunities, because they have to be shared. The seat at the table has to be shared. For a long time, we have seen that global south, there's a lot of information that so people use that access to information. They take that information. They've built brands, organizations themselves on it, to speak very candidly. But I think they've not taken people along with them, and I think that again comes back to the main topic. Let's take everyone along and create those spaces that those voices can be heard at the table instead of someone else speaking for you. And if that channel and that corridor can be created, there would be nothing more powerful than that.
Right. Great. I'll do just this one question that's for Abhishek. It's but from Gori. They ask, how do you encourage T3 for suppliers to cooperate with transparency platforms? As even though the brands want to showcase their supply chains and be transparent about their partners, it's very difficult to collect data from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Gauri. And at Fairtrade, of course, we want to go right to the first mile, which is farmers. So we do greatly value the use of technology, use of these mechanisms for tracking the whole value chain. We ourselves also have a platform called Fairtrace, through which at a transaction level, we're trying to track down what is happening in the supply chains that we are working with. And thereafter, I think that's the starting point. So transparency and traceability, I would say, is the starting point, and only thereafter can you actually get into it. But you would be amazed how many brands and, in fact, even manufacturers in the value chain do not have visibility of where the supply chain starts and what's happening there, right? So I think legislation, as we've talked about CSDDD already, there's also other legislations which are looking at what's happening in the forests, for instance. So the Deforestation Act that is coming also in the EU. All of these legislations are in many ways putting that compulsion to have that transparency and that visibility, which will ultimately then bring businesses to get into it. From a voluntary basis, I think uh, promoting traceable systems, which is something that we do at Fairtrade, is critical. And then providing that information and layering that information with the qualitative components around the conditions, the environmental and social conditions on it, is how at Fairtrade, that's how we proceed. There are also obviously certain data protection acts which are coming into play, which also affect how things are shared. But I think that overall there is an understanding that you need to have full visibility and then accountability for what is happening there. So that's something at Fairtrade also that we are systematically working towards.
Right. Thank you. I do recognize we're just a little bit over, so I'll quickly wrap up. Thank you so much to the speakers for making time this afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you're coming in from. And also to everyone who joined. So, after we've had a conversation like this, it's always like, oh, what more can you do? We can always keep the conversation growing. We do at Threading Change, we are doing the Fair Fashion Festival this week. If you're located in Bangalore, India, or Kenya, or in Vancouver, Canada, you can look at events that that are happening this week. You can follow us on Instagram, visit our website, or on Twitter, or LinkedIn, and you can find information on the events that are happening today, tomorrow, and for the rest of the week. And let's keep the conversation growing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Look forward to
Bye-bye.
participating in more
Take
such
care.
discussions. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you to our panelists. I learned
Thank
so much. Really
Yeah, me-
appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
As Ash mentioned, we also dropped a chat for the live recording. It'll be ready in 1 hour. We can also send out an email. Thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.